Hello everyone, today I'm going to talk about how snakes traverse complex 3D terrain. As we all know, snake moves incredibly well in complex 3D environments. They are able to generate thrust by deforming their elongate bodies. Many studies have focused on their locomotion on flat planes with small height variation, and have found some basic gaits such as lateral undulation, concertina, rectilinear, and sidewinding. Some researchers have looked into their locomotion on flat surfaces with obstacles. They found that the snakes are able to use lateral oscillation to push against obstacles for forward thrust. However, very few terrestrial studies have considered terrains with large height variation or the role of vertical bending. Studies about their arboreal locomotion have shown that they are able to use both lateral and vertical bending to traverse complex environments, for example, climbing between branches. And in a previous study in our lab, we found that the snakes are able to use lateral undulation and vertical bending to traverse a large step. Henry Esseley's lab also recently found that snakes can use vertical bending to propel against the environment to move forward. Here, the snake is traversing a horizontal ladder and able to generate sufficient thrust from vertical bending. This was confirmed by measuring reaction forces from these horizontal rods, as shown here. This yellow curve shows the fore and aft force, and the propulsive impulse is more than double of the braking impulse, which implies that the snake can generate propulsion in this vertical plane by this vertical bending. They also found that the snake can do similarly in a channel with one triangular block. Initially, the snake uses concertina gait to slowly move forward, but concertina is no longer needed once it reaches this block and starts to use vertical bending. So here comes our hypothesis. Can vertical bending provide propulsion similarly as lateral oscillation in complex environments, for example in this rubble-like terrain? To test it, we built a rubble-like terrain with very low friction blocks built from acrylic. Their heights follow a normal distribution. We then attached B-tags to each block and tracked them using 12 cameras. We drove 3 corn snakes to traverse the terrain in 33 trials and tracked the B-tags attached to their body. Then we interpolated the continuous body using a custom method. This method has higher accuracy compared to previously used B-spline method, and the error is well below the radius. Here is an example of the reconstruction we projected back to camera views. We also plotted out the sagittal plane view to show the interaction between the snake body and the terrain outline. As you can see here, the penetration is mostly smaller than body radius, which means that we can look into the content from this kinematics data quite reasonably. We also color-coded each terrain block. A block is colored in red if it's higher than the average height of the nearby body. It's colored in white if it's below the body and directly supporting the animal. It's colored in blue if it's below the body but not contacting it, and it's colored in gray if it's the other case. We found that the animal usually travels with very little slip. The average slip angle is only 14 degrees. It looks like it's moving in a tube. And also, it tends to go through valleys, which means it tends to go over the lower blocks of the terrain. Previous studies have found that snakes can generate propulsion from lateral bending and pushing against obstacles. They are also able to generate propulsion from vertical bending and pushing against a horizontal ladder. So in our case, is lateral bending alone sufficient? Or do snakes also use vertical bending for propulsion? We don't have force measurement yet, but with 3D reconstruction, we can begin to understand the interaction and quantify the possible forces to test this hypothesis. So from the 3D reconstruction data, we can determine different types of body-terrain contact. The simplest case is that the snake body is not contacting the terrain. Then we have cases when the snake contacts the terrain with lateral sides. For example, it can push a vertical wall like this, and from the top view, it will be like this. We assume that because of the very smooth acrylic surface, the friction can be ignored, so the normal reaction force will be like this. The snake body can also push a vertical edge like this, and we'll assume that the reaction force is like this in top view with a 45-degree angle. We also have cases when a snake contacts the terrain with its bottom side. For example, it can contact the horizontal surface showing this 3D view and this side view. We assume that this will generate a normal force upward, ignoring the friction. The snake body is also able to push a horizontal edge like this. Then we assume that this will generate a force with a 45-degree angle in this side view. Again, these force assumptions may not be accurate quantitatively because we don't have force measurement yet, but they could give us some idea of possible force distribution. Also, we only focus on cases with horizontal force components, which means we only focus on these three cases. This is because we want to evaluate if it's possible to only use lateral bending for thrust, which is in the horizontal plane. Here is an example of different contact conditions along the body. Aside from terrain color code, we also color-coded the body based on which side the segment is contacting the terrain. The red segments are possibly contacting terrain with its belly and can push vertically on a horizontal edge. The green segments are possibly contacting terrain with the lateral sides and can push laterally. The blue segments are possibly contacting terrain with its belly, but may only experience upward supporting forces. And the other segments, for example, the suspending ones, are colored in black. We also plotted out the center of mass of the entire snake and its velocity in black arrow and acceleration in red arrow. Let's take a closer look at some examples of the green lateral pushing points. Here, these segments are pushing laterally against a red higher block. We assume that this will generate forces with horizontal components like these red arrows, depending on whether they are more likely pushing against this vertical wall or the vertical edge, which is shown at the corner of this block in this top view. Similarly, we did this for other green lateral pushing points. Here is an example of vertical pushing points. These segments are transitioning from contacting a white block to suspending above a blue block. We assume that they will generate a force with horizontal component like this red arrow. Similarly, we did this for the other red vertical pushing points. Then we can evaluate how much does vertical or lateral bending parts possibly contribute to thrust. First, for each body segment, we check whether it is possible to contribute to thrust by looking at the angle between the possible assumed force and the center of mass velocity in the horizontal plane. If the angle is smaller than 90 degrees, we say that this segment adds one possible contribution. Otherwise, it doesn't add to the possible contribution. We didn't subtract 1 here because the animal can choose not to apply the force along this direction if it does not contribute to forward thrust. Then for both vertical and lateral pushing points, we look at all the body segments along the body and count how many of them can possibly contribute to forward thrust. For example, here there are 3 vertical pushing points colored in red, and among them, 2 segments can possibly generate forward force. So the sum of possible contribution from vertical pushing part is 2. And here there are 2 lateral pushing points, and among them, only 1 can generate forward thrust. So the sum of possible contribution for lateral pushing parts along this body is 1. Note that we usually have several thousands of segments along the body from our 3D interpolation. Here is just a simple example for the illustration. Here shows the possible contribution from lateral and vertical bending in one trial. The max possible contribution is around 7,000 because we have 7,000 segments along the body. As you can see, sometimes lateral bending possibly contributes more to the thrust, such as at this moment, while sometimes vertical bending possibly contributes more, such as this moment. Here is an example from the trial I just showed when lateral bending is not sufficient. As you can see, the green lateral pushing parts are not likely to generate forces matching the overall moving direction, but the red vertical pushing points may do so, for example, from this point by pushing horizontal edge. Then we calculated in how many video frames out of 4 does lateral or vertical bending parts possibly contribute more. For example, if one trial has 100 video frames, and the vertical bending has a larger sum of possible contribution in 38 of them than the ratio of dominating frames, the y-axis value for vertical bending is 38%. So on average, vertical bending possibly contributes more in 38% of time, and lateral bending contributes more in the rest 62% of time. We also calculated the ratio of all possible contribution for each trial, then look at the values from all trials. For example, if in one trial, the average sum of possible contribution from all the segments in each video frame equals to 100, and among them 41 comes from vertical bending and 59 comes from lateral bending, then the average ratio of possible contribution, the y-axis value for vertical bending, is 41%. So on average, vertical bending provides 41% of the possible contribution, and lateral bending provides the rest 59%. As a summary, first, snakes can traverse low-friction, rugged terrain without much slip. Second, both lateral and vertical bending are important in providing for both thrust, but we don't know if they prefer one over another. Third, because we only drew the conclusions temporarily from estimated possible forces, so it is still essential to measure the terrain force. And we will build a sensorizable block by adding a sensor between the rubble and the ground. Lastly, we are planning to test the bending strategies by using a robophysical model. For this part, please see our other talk in the biomimetics and robotics session. That's all for my talk, and thank you for listening, and thank my lab mates and colleagues for the help.